It was late August when I first set foot on Edisto Beach, South Carolina, a quiet, unassuming town where the Atlantic stretched out forever, lapping against the shore with an unbroken rhythm. I had come for work, a research project through the University of Charleston, assisting with coastal erosion studies, but I saw it as an escape. My name is Daniel Reeves, a second-year grad student in marine biology, and I had been looking forward to this trip all summer. Fieldwork was always preferable to the monotony of campus, and I relished the thought of spending weeks on the shore, collecting samples, measuring tidal shifts, and monitoring the ever-changing sandbars. But something about Edisto was off from the moment I arrived. It wasn't the town itself. It was small, picturesque, the kind of place retirees and vacationers flocked to in search of solitude. No, it was something beneath the surface. The air smelled wrong, heavy with more than just the scent of salt and fish. The waves, though calm, carried an undertone of unease, a strange stillness that made my skin prickle. I rented a small beach house near the southernmost point of the island, just a short walk from where I'd be conducting my research. It was a modest place, one of those old stilted houses raised on wooden beams, its exterior weathered and salt-bleached. The first night, as I lay in bed listening to the waves, I realized something peculiar. There were no gulls. No sounds of life at all, really, just the water, steady and relentless. Every beach I had ever visited had gulls, the occasional distant barking of a dog, the hum of insects. But here, nothing. It was as if the entire coast was holding its breath. The first few days were uneventful, at least in terms of research. I spent my mornings wading into the surf with a clipboard, noting tidal patterns, and setting up equipment to monitor coastal shifts. The work was solitary, but I didn't mind. What did bother me, though, was the way the locals seemed to regard the ocean. They didn't go near it. Even in the sweltering summer heat, the beaches were mostly empty. I'd see a few tourists during the day, families from out of town laughing and splashing in the surf, but the locals? They stayed inland, watching from the dunes with expressions I couldn't quite place. Caution? Disdain? Fear? I asked a bartender one night why the beaches were more crowded, and he just shrugged. Tides are strange here, he said, not meeting my eye. Sometimes it's best to leave the ocean alone. On the fourth day, I found something. I had been walking the shore, following the receding tide, when I saw it, something half buried in the wet sand, tangled in a mass of dark seaweed. It was a boat, or at least what remained of one. A small fishing vessel, no more than 20 feet long, its hull rotted and splintered, covered in barnacles. It hadn't been there the day before. The name, though barely legible, sent a chill down my spine, the Marion. I knew that name. 3 months ago, I had read about the Marion in the Charleston Gazette. It was a fishing boat that had vanished without a trace somewhere off the coast of Edisto. The Coast Guard had searched for weeks, but no wreckage was ever found. And yet, here it was, washed ashore like some discarded carcass. I waded closer, pushing aside the slimy tangle of seaweed, my fingers brushing against the warm wood. There was something inside the boat. At first, I thought it was just debris, but as I peered over the edge, my stomach clenched. A hand. Or what was left of one. The flesh was bloated, discolored, the fingers curled into a rigid claw. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the surf. The police arrived within the hour, sealing off the area and bombarding me with questions. I told them everything, the boat, the body, the strange feeling that had been gnawing at me since I arrived. They nodded, took notes, but their expressions remained unreadable. When I asked if they thought it was one of the missing fishermen, one officer hesitated before answering. Hard to say, he said. We'll need forensics, but we don't usually get wreckage like this. That night, the dream started. I woke sometime past midnight, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me. In my dream, I had been underwater, deep below the surface, where the light didn't reach. Something had been watching me, something massive and unseen, shifting in the dark. I could still hear it, even as I sat upright in bed, gasping for breath. A low, rhythmic sound, like the distant call of a whale, but deeper, wrong. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination, shaken by the events of the day. But as I lay back down, listening to the ocean through the thin walls of the house, I swore I heard something else beneath the waves. Something moving. Something coming closer. The morning after finding the Marion, I woke to an unnatural stillness. The ocean was calmer than I had ever seen it, too calm. The waves, which should have been rolling onto the shore in their endless, predictable rhythm, barely seemed to move. The tide was low, revealing a vast stretch of wet sand that glistened under the morning sun. Something about it felt exposed, unnatural, like a wound laid bare. I hesitated before heading out, still shaken from the dreams, but I forced myself to push through the unease. Work was work, and I had data to collect. I walked to my usual site, a mile south of where the boat had washed up, carrying my measuring tools and field notes. But when I arrived, something was wrong. The sand near the waterline was covered in a strange, oily residue, thick, black, and clinging to the grains in unnatural patterns. At first, I thought it might be oil from a spill, but the way it moved unsettled me. It didn't spread like liquid, it pulsed, shifting in slow, deliberate ripples as if it were alive. When I crouched down for a closer look, the smell hit me, rotten, briny, something ancient and foul dredged up from the deep. I decided to take a sample. Pulling out a small collection jar, I scooped some of the strange substance into it, sealing the lid tight. It left a slick residue on my fingers, and the moment it touched my skin, an involuntary shiver ran through me. The sensation was hard to describe, cold, almost electric, like the static charge before a storm. I wiped my hands on my pants, but the feeling lingered, deep under the skin. I had just started taking notes when I saw them. Footprints. They started near the water's edge, weaving in irregular, staggering patterns up the beach. At first, I assumed they were from an animal. The deep impressions could have been left by a large seabird or even a wayward dog, but as I traced them with my eyes, I realized how wrong I was. The prints were human. Barefoot. But they were wrong, too wide, too long, the toes splayed unnaturally far apart, as if whatever had made them wasn't used to walking on land. And there was another detail that sent a chill up my spine. The tracks weren't leading toward the ocean. They were coming from it. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, my mind trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe someone had gone for a swim before dawn, wandered the beach, and the tide had simply erased their path back. But that didn't explain the size of the prints. It didn't explain their erratic, stumbling path, as if whoever had left them wasn't used to walking upright. I followed them, cautiously at first, then quicker as my curiosity overpowered my fear. The trail led me up the shore, toward the dunes. The sand became drier, looser, making the tracks harder to see, but I could still make them out, weaving toward a cluster of beach grass and weathered driftwood. And then, suddenly, they stopped. No return path. No signs of struggle. Just an abrupt end, as if the person, or thing, had simply vanished. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. Even the waves seemed hesitant, lapping weakly against the shore. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the grass, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I heard something else, something low and wet, a bubbling rasp, like the last breath of a drowning man. I turned sharply, scanning the empty stretch of beach. Nothing. I was done for the day. Back at the beach house, I placed the sample jar on my desk, staring at it under the dim light of the lamp. The substance inside shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if reacting to my gaze. I told myself it was just settling, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. I decided to call the university, see if one of my professors could analyze it, but when I picked up my phone, there was no signal. That was strange. Edisto wasn't exactly a technological hub, but I had never had trouble with reception before. I walked to the window, holding my phone up, searching for a single bar. And that's when I saw something standing at the water's edge. A figure, motionless, half-shrouded in mist. The air was thick, humid, distorting the shape, but I could make out the basics. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, too thin, hanging at its sides like dead weight. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. Watching. I blinked, and it was gone. The mist swallowed it whole, leaving nothing behind but the empty beach and the quiet, endless ocean. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Had it even been there? Or had I imagined it? I told myself I was overtired, my mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned back toward my desk, my eyes landed on the jar. The substance inside was moving. Not settling. Shifting. Curling in slow, deliberate patterns against the glass, as if something inside was trying to find a way out. I barely slept that night. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the whisper of the waves and the occasional creak of the old beach house settling on its stilts. Every so often, I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see that figure again, looming at the water's edge, watching. But the mist had thickened, swallowing the shoreline completely, reducing everything outside to a blank, gray void. The sample jar sat on my desk, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the black substance shifting, pulsing, reacting. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was letting exhaustion and paranoia get the best of me. But that didn't explain the footprints. It didn't explain the figure on the beach. At some point, probably around 3 a.m., I got up. I needed to get out of the house, to clear my head. The air outside was thick and damp, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The mist clung to everything, rolling in slow, ghostly tendrils around the wooden stilts of the beach houses, curling through the empty streets like something alive. The town was silent. No wind, no distant hum of cars, just the rhythmic hush of the tide. I walked toward the shore, moving cautiously through the fog, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the dunes, I stopped. The sand was wet and cool beneath my feet, and I realized the tide had receded further than I'd ever seen before. The beach stretched out endlessly, revealing sandbars that were usually hidden beneath the water. Pools of seawater glistened in the moonlight, scattered like glassy wounds across the exposed seabed. And then I saw them. Footprints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, crisscrossing the wet sand. Some were small, human, bare feet moving hesitantly across the exposed shore. But others were like the ones I had found earlier that day. Wrong. Too wide. Too long. Toes split unnaturally far apart. And they all led in one direction, toward the water. I followed them, heart pounding. My brain was screaming at me to turn back, to run, to pretend I hadn't seen any of this. But I kept moving, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. I felt like I was walking into something I wasn't meant to see. And then I saw the first body. It was a man, half buried in the sand, his arms stretched out in front of him as if he had been trying to crawl away from something. His skin was pale, waterlogged, his clothes shredded and covered in that same black, oily residue. His eyes were open. Mouth open too. I took a step back, heart hammering against my ribs. My first thought was that it was one of the missing fishermen from the Marion, but then I saw another body. And another. Scattered across the exposed sand, half buried, twisted in unnatural angles. Some were fresher, others bloated, decomposed beyond recognition. And they all had the same expression. Mouths open. Eyes wide. Frozen and silent, eternal screams. I couldn't breathe. I turned to run, stumbling backward, my feet sinking into the wet sand. And that's when I saw it. Out beyond the sandbars, where the water should have been deep, something was rising. The sea was receding, pulling back in unnatural waves, exposing more of the ocean floor than should have ever been possible. And in that vast, empty space, something was moving beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was just the shifting tide, but then I saw the shapes. Dark. Massive. Uncoiling. There were limbs, impossibly long, stretching outward like the roots of some ancient tree. They slid through the wet sand with a slow, deliberate grace, disappearing beneath the mist. And then, I heard it. A sound so low, so deep, it felt like it was inside my bones. A resonance more than a noise, vibrating through the ground, through my skull, through my teeth. It wasn't a whale song, wasn't anything natural. It was calling. And the bodies were moving. Not the dead ones. The ones that had left those footprints. I hadn't noticed them before, shadows at the edge of the mist, figures crouched low against the sand, still as stone. But now they were rising. Slowly, jerkily, like marionettes being pulled upright by invisible strings. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their limbs twitching, adjusting to the weight of gravity. And their eyes were black. I ran. I don't remember making it back to the house. I don't remember slamming the door behind me, locking it, pressing my back against the wall, gasping for breath. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, shaking, my mind struggling to process what I had seen. I forced myself to my feet, moving toward the window. The fog had thickened, swallowing the beach completely, but I knew they were out there. Waiting. I turned to the sample jar on my desk, my hands trembling as I reached for it. It was empty. The black substance was gone. And in its place, smeared against the inside of the glass, were 5 long, splayed fingerprints. Morning came, but the sun never fully broke through the fog. The sky was gray, the air thick and damp, pressing against me like a second skin. I hadn't slept. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those things rising from the sand, limbs jerking unnaturally, their black, empty eyes fixed on something unseen. And the sound. That awful, resonant call that had vibrated through my bones like some deep, impossible frequency. I kept telling myself I imagined it. That sleep deprivation was making my mind play tricks. But the footprints on the beach were real. The bodies were real. And the empty sample jar on my desk was real. The first thing I did was pack. My hands moved on instinct, shoving my clothes into my duffel, grabbing my laptop, my notebooks, my keys. Every inch of my body screamed to leave, to get as far away from Edisto as possible. Whatever was happening here, whatever had been happening, I wanted no part of it. But as I reached for my phone to book the first ferry off the island, I froze. There was a voicemail. I hadn't heard the phone ring, hadn't even noticed the missed call. But there it was, a single notification, time-stamped at 3:12 a.m. The exact time I had been staring out my window, watching the fog thicken over the beach. I played it. At first, it was just static. A low, wet crackling sound, like something shifting beneath the waves. Then, a voice. No, not a voice. Voices. Layered, overlapping, whispering in a language I didn't understand. The words were garbled, distorted, but the tone was unmistakable. Hungry. Insistent. I nearly dropped the phone. My pulse hammered against my skull. I deleted the message, but my fingers were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. I didn't want to hear it again. I didn't want whatever had left it to know I had heard it. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my bag and threw open the door, only to stop cold. Someone was standing in the driveway. An old man. Thin, weathered, his skin tanned and wrinkled from decades of salt and sun. He was dressed in a faded work shirt and loose canvas pants, the kind you'd see on old fishermen down at the docks. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Pale. Cloudy. Like he had been staring at the ocean too long and forgotten how to look away. You saw it. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken in years. He didn't ask. He stated it. Like he already knew. I opened my mouth to deny it, to brush past him, but something in his expression made me stop. A deep, sunken exhaustion. Fear, old and worn. He had seen it too. The beach, I said, barely above a whisper. The bodies. The things. The old man nodded once. You need to leave, he said. Before the tide changes. I swallowed hard. I was just about to. But what the hell is happening here? What did I see last night? The man's gaze flickered toward the horizon. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the churning waves beyond the dunes. Even from here, the water looked wrong. Darker than it should have been. "It's waking up." The words sent an ice-cold bolt through my spine. "The hell does that mean?" I asked. "What's waking up?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and round, pressing it into my palm. A smooth stone. Dark green, almost black, polished by the tide. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, ancient, intricate, spiraling in patterns that made my head throb the longer I looked at them. "Keep this with you," he said. "It won't stop it, but it might help." "Help what?" My voice rose, frustration breaking through my fear. Why is no one talking about this? Why does everyone pretend nothing is wrong? The old man exhaled slowly. "Because we've learned to live with it," he murmured. "And those that don't live long." A long silence stretched between us. The waves crashed against the shore, rhythmic, steady. Like breathing. And then, the old man took a step back. "Don't go near the water," he warned. "Not tonight. Especially not tonight." And just like that, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the mist as suddenly as he had appeared. I should have left right then. I should have taken the stone, gotten in my car, and driven straight to the ferry. But I didn't. Because something inside me, a reckless, stupid need to know, held me back. I had spent my whole academic career chasing the mysteries of the ocean. And this was something beyond anything I had ever encountered. I had to see it. One last time. As night fell, I returned to the beach. The air was different now, heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. The tide had pulled back even further, revealing more of the ocean floor than I had ever seen. Pools of water glistened like empty eyes, reflecting the darkening sky. And then I saw them. Silhouettes in the mist. Standing in the water. They weren't moving. Just waiting. Dozens of them, their bodies half submerged, their faces turned toward the horizon. The ones I had seen before, the ones that had risen from the sand, were there. But there were others now, too. Fishermen. Locals. People I had seen in town just days ago. Standing among them. Their eyes were black. Their mouths open. And as I watched, frozen, unable to move, the tide began to rise. The water lapped at their feet, surging forward in slow, steady pulses. It covered their ankles, their knees, their waists. And still, they didn't move. And then, they sank. Not like drowning victims. Not like people being pulled under by force. They descended. Slowly. Deliberately. Letting the water claim them. One by one, they vanished beneath the surface. And as the last head disappeared below the waves, I heard it again. That deep, impossible call. The sound of something stirring. Something awakening. I turned and ran, the cold stone clutched tight in my palm, the weight of the ocean pressing against my back like an unseen hand. I didn't stop running until I was locked inside my house, every door bolted, every window latched. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. I didn't sleep. I sat curled in the corner of my tiny beach house, gripping the smooth, dark stone the old man had given me, my knuckles white as I listened to the wind rattle the glass. The sound outside had changed. It wasn't just the ocean anymore, it was something deeper, something alive, a low, rhythmic pulse beneath the waves, slow and steady like a heartbeat. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, that I had spent too much time alone, staring at the water, letting the vastness of it press into my mind. But I knew better. I had seen them, the people who had walked into the ocean without hesitation, without resistance, as if something had called them home. The worst part was that I wasn't sure if I could fight it, because I could hear it now. Not outside, not in the wind or the waves, but inside me. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. More like a whisper in the back of my mind, curling and stretching with the tide, a slow, insistent pull. A longing. A need to go back to the shore. To see. My hands were ice cold as I clutched the stone tighter, fighting the growing pressure in my skull. I needed to leave before it got worse. I grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and shoved open the door. The wind slammed against me, thick with salt and moisture, as I stepped onto the quiet street. Something was wrong. The town was empty. Houses sat dark and lifeless, no porch lights glowing, no flickering televisions in windows. It was as if everyone had simply disappeared. Or worse, maybe they had walked into the water, too. I ran. My car was parked a block away near a closed diner, the same spot I had left it the night before. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I reached into my pocket for the keys, fingers fumbling, pulse hammering in my ears. The whisper in my head grew louder. My vision blurred, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys. They hit the pavement with a sharp metallic clink, rolling under the car. I swore under my breath, dropping to my knees, scrambling to reach for them. That's when I saw it, a set of footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't normal. They came from the other side of the street, long and splayed, trailing through the mist, leading directly to my car. The same ones I had seen on the beach, and they were fresh. I forced my body to move, yanking the keys from beneath the car and scrambling upright. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands trembled as I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted hard. The engine sputtered, clicked, and went silent. My stomach lurched. It wouldn't start. A movement outside caught my eye. I turned, breath hitching in my throat, pulse hammering in my skull. A figure stood motionless in the mist. Tall. Watching. My fingers clenched around the steering wheel as I squinted through the fog, trying to make out the details. I didn't need to. I already knew. It was one of them. One of the drowned. It lifted a hand, slow and deliberate, fingers curling in a beckoning motion. The whisper in my head became a roar. I pressed the gas pedal instinctively, but the car wasn't running. My body screamed at me to move, to get away now. I twisted the key again, hands slick with sweat, wrenching it hard enough that it nearly snapped. The engine sputtered, choked, then suddenly roared to life. The radio came on, blaring static. Warped voices crackled through the speakers, layered and overlapping, something shifting beneath the white noise, wet and gurgling. The headlights flickered, casting long, flickering shadows through the mist. Then, beneath the static, a voice. Come back. I slammed the gear into drive and floored it. The tires shrieked against the wet pavement as the car lurched forward. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. The bridge out of town was 2 miles away, and I was going to make it. The whisper clawed at the back of my mind, pleading, but I gritted my teeth and gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. And then, the ocean rose. A wall of water, impossibly high, surged from the coastline, swallowing the road ahead. It moved wrong, not like a normal wave, not like a force of nature, but like something alive, something reaching, pulling. I barely had time to react. I yanked the wheel to the side, tires skidding as the car spun. The headlights cut through the mist, illuminating something in the water, something shifting, uncoiling, moving, but I refused to look. The car slammed into something solid. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. And then, darkness. I woke to silence. The car was sideways, half submerged in a ditch. My head throbbed, vision swimming as I blinked against the dull glow of the broken headlights. Blood dripped warm down my temple, the taste of copper thick in my mouth. The windshield was cracked but intact, long fractures spiderwebbing across the glass. My ears rang, my body aching, but I was alive. And then I realized the whisper was gone. For the first time in hours, maybe days, my mind was my own again. I forced the door open, stumbling out into the cold night air. My legs were weak, the ground unsteady beneath me. I turned toward the ocean and froze. The water was gone. Not just the tide. The entire ocean had disappeared. The seabed stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and exposed, slick with pools of seawater that glistened in the moonlight. Writhing things lay half buried in the sand, sluggish and shifting, blinking slow, alien eyes against the sudden dryness. And further out, where the deep water should have been, something enormous loomed in the darkness. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a storm. It was alive. And it was looking at me. I turned and ran. My breath tore from my throat in short, ragged gasps, legs burning as I sprinted toward the bridge. The road stretched out ahead, black and endless, and beyond it, the mainland. I could escape. I could leave. But as I ran, one last thought uncoiled in my mind, sinking deep, embedding itself like a hook. The ocean had pulled back. The water had gone still. And when it came rushing back, it would take everything with it. I ran until my legs nearly gave out, the cold air burning my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears like a drumbeat against the silence. The bridge was ahead, stretching toward the mainland, a thin strip of asphalt suspended over the dry seabed below. I forced myself forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind screaming at me to move faster. The whisper was gone, but I could still feel something, an absence where it had been, a space in my mind that had been filled by something vast, something waiting. The sky above was empty, starless, a yawning black void pressing against the earth. The air was heavy, thick with salt and something else, something metallic, sharp against my tongue. My body felt wrong, every muscle aching as if I had been submerged in deep water for too long, the weight of the ocean still clinging to my skin. And behind me, the water had not yet returned. The exposed seabed stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a grotesque expanse of slick, glistening sand and shifting, writhing things. Some of them were still alive. I saw them moving, pale, bloated forms twisting in the moonlight, their bodies half buried in the wet muck, their long, spindly limbs twitching as they struggled against the dry air. Others lay still, their bodies ruptured, spilling dark fluids onto the sand. These things had never been meant to surface. And further out, where the deep ocean should have been, it was rising. The shape was massive, too large to comprehend, its form shifting, uncoiling from the abyss like something that had been asleep for a very, very long time. I couldn't see its full body, only glimpses of it, an enormous, heaving mass shifting in the darkness, limbs or tendrils moving slowly through the air, impossibly long, curling against the sky like the roots of some ancient, submerged tree. It had no face, no clear features, only a presence, a vast and terrible weight pressing against reality, stretching the space around it like a wound in the world itself. And then I felt it notice me. My body locked up instantly, a deep and primal terror seizing my limbs, every nerve screaming as an impossible weight settled over me. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. My mind buckled under the sheer enormity of it, the sheer wrongness of its existence. It was looking at me, not with eyes, not with anything human, but with something deeper, something that could see me in ways I would never understand. It was ancient, beyond time, beyond memory. It had been here before the land, before the tides, before anything that walked or swam had ever existed. And I was nothing to it. I was prey. A deep sound rumbled through the air, not a roar, not a voice, but something felt in the bones, in the marrow, a vibration that spread through the ground, through the sky, through me. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, my chest, filling my lungs with something cold and heavy, something wrong. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and for one horrible second, I understood. It had called them back. The people. The ones who had walked into the sea. The drowned. They weren't gone. They had never been gone. They were still down there, deep beneath the surface, waiting, changing, becoming something else. Something that belonged to it. And I had heard the call too. I had nearly followed. The weight in my chest built until I thought my ribs would crack, the pressure unbearable, my body sinking, folding under it. I could feel the ocean returning, the distant, silent pull of the tide gathering its strength, preparing to rush forward and reclaim everything it had left behind. It would come suddenly, without warning, sweeping over the seabed in a towering black wall, swallowing the land, pulling me under. And I knew that if it took me, I wouldn't drown. I would change. I forced myself to move. The effort nearly broke me, every limb fighting against an unseen force, my body screaming in protest as I stumbled forward, gasping for air. My vision swam, the world tilting beneath my feet as I staggered toward the bridge, every step heavier than the last. My mind was unraveling, pieces of it stretching toward the thing behind me, drawn like threads in an unseen current, and I knew that if I looked back, if I really looked at it, I would never move again. I reached the bridge and collapsed against the rusted guardrail, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The air felt different here, thinner, lighter, as if I had stepped just far enough from its grasp. The whisper didn't return, but something deeper, something older still lingered at the edges of my thoughts, pressing against the fragile barrier of my mind. And then, finally, the water returned. I heard it before I saw it, a deep, distant roar, building, growing, rushing. The wind howled, the sky darkened, and then, like a great and terrible breath, the ocean inhaled. The seabed vanished beneath a black surge, a monstrous wave swallowing everything in its path. It hit the shore with a force that shook the ground, sending torrents of seawater crashing against the bridge, flooding the roads, ripping through the empty town. The bodies were gone in an instant, swept away, pulled back into the depths. The creatures that had been writhing in the open air vanished beneath the tide, disappearing as if they had never existed. And then, silence. The ocean had returned to normal. The waves lapped gently against the shore, steady, endless, as if nothing had ever happened. The sky cleared, the wind settled, and Edisto Beach was just a quiet, empty town again, untouched by what had come before. But I knew better. I stood there for a long time, staring at the water, at the place where it had been. The old man's words echoed in my mind, his warning clear now in a way it hadn't been before. The people who lived here didn't talk about it. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look too long at the sea. Because they had learned. And those who didn't, those who saw too much, never left. I turned and walked away, not looking back, not stopping, not letting the weight of it settle into my bones. I didn't know where I would go, only that I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the thing that had noticed me, had seen me, had almost taken me. Because deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. And one day, when the tide was right, when the water pulled back again, when the ocean took its next great breath, it would call for me again. And I wasn't sure I'd be able to resist. I didn't stop driving until I was far inland, far from the coast, far from the place where the ocean had seen me. The roads blurred together in my exhaustion, the night stretching long and endless, the hum of the engine the only thing grounding me in reality. I kept the window cracked, letting the cold air whip against my face, hoping it would keep me awake, keep my mind from drifting back toward the thing that still felt too close. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving behind me, something following. But there was nothing. Just empty roads and the long, dark stretch of forest on either side. At some point, just before dawn, I pulled into a roadside motel, the neon vacancy sign buzzing weakly in the cold air. The woman at the front desk barely looked at me as I handed her my card, her tired eyes flickering up only briefly before she slid the key across the counter. I knew what I looked like, filthy, salt-streaked, eyes wild from lack of sleep, but I didn't care. I needed a bed. I needed time to think. The room smelled like stale air and old carpet, but it was warm. I locked the door, latched the deadbolt, and pulled the curtains shut before sitting on the edge of the bed, my body still vibrating with adrenaline. My hands ached. When I looked down, my fingers were stiff and pale, my nails cracked from gripping the steering wheel too hard. And in my pocket, the smooth, dark stone the old man had given me still pulsed with the faintest warmth. I pulled it out slowly, turning it over in my palm, tracing the strange etchings with my thumb. The patterns weren't random, I could feel that now. They meant something. They had always meant something. I didn't understand them, but my body did. Something deep in me recognized them, the way an animal recognizes the scent of a predator. It wasn't protection, not really. It was a warning. A marker. A tether. I clenched my fist around it, pressing it hard into my palm, feeling the edges dig into my skin. I was still connected to it. I wasn't free. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I leaned forward, pressing my elbows into my knees, my breath coming in slow, uneven gasps. I wanted to believe I had escaped, that putting miles between myself and the shore had severed whatever pull had been working its way into my bones. But deep down, I knew better. Because I could still hear it. Faint. Almost imperceptible. But there. A sound beneath the sound. A whisper beneath the silence. I forced myself to lie down, staring at the ceiling, willing my mind to be quiet. The exhaustion was too much, my body finally giving in, muscles unraveling as I sank into the stiff motel mattress. Sleep took me quickly, but it wasn't peaceful. I dreamed of the sea. It wasn't Edisto anymore. It wasn't anywhere I had ever seen before. The water was black, thick as oil, stretching endlessly in all directions, the horizon lost in the haze of a storm that never moved, never broke. I was floating, weightless, my limbs heavy, my breath slow and deep, as if I had been breathing the water for years. Shapes moved beneath me, vast and slow, their silhouettes shifting in the darkness, too large to comprehend. I didn't fight it. I wasn't afraid. I belonged. A shadow passed overhead, blotting out the weak, gray light from above. Something reached for me, a limb or a tendril or something that had never needed a name, its presence brushing against my skin like a memory. And then I heard it. Not in whispers this time. Not distant. A voice. Deep and endless. You were the first to turn away. The words vibrated through my ribs, my skull, sinking into my lungs like water. I tried to move, tried to pull myself away, but the sea held me tight, the weight of it pressing me down, down, down. But you will come back. I woke with a sharp gasp, the taste of salt thick on my tongue, my skin damp with sweat. The room was silent, the air heavy, the light outside dim with the early morning haze. For a long moment, I just lay there, my chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths, the echoes of the dream still lingering at the edges of my mind. The stone was still in my hand. And when I looked down, the symbols had changed. I stared at it for too long, my thoughts unraveling, my body frozen in a state of delayed panic. I knew, without understanding how, that the stone had not just changed, it had been changed. Altered. As if the dream, or the thing within the dream, had reached out and left something behind. The lines were sharper now, more deliberate. And there was something new in the center, something that hadn't been there before. An eye. Not human. Not anything I could describe. Just a single, unblinking mark carved into the surface, watching me. I nearly threw it across the room. I didn't. Instead, I pressed it to the desk, gripping the edges with white-knuckled fingers, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't over. It had never been over. I had left the shore, but it hadn't let me go. I was marked. I stood abruptly, knocking over the chair behind me, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't stay here. I needed answers, now. The old man, he had known something. More than he had told me. More than he wanted to tell me. If I was going to survive this, if I was going to find a way to sever whatever connection had been forged between me and the thing in the water, I needed to find him. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag, moving with the sharp, unsteady energy of someone running on fear alone. My body still ached, exhaustion weighing down my limbs, but I ignored it. I had to keep moving. By the time I was back on the road, the sun had risen higher, but the light felt weak, washed out, like something had leached the color from the world. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, kept my eyes forward, pushing the car faster, further inland, further from the whisper that still curled at the edges of my mind. But the road stretched long and empty, the miles rolling by in silence. And in the back of my head, buried beneath the sound of my own breathing, the whisper still lingered. You will come back. The highway stretched long and empty before me, the pale morning light casting ghostly shadows across the cracked asphalt. I had been driving for hours, my mind locked in a restless, feverish loop, replaying the dream, the voice, the shifting symbols on the stone. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel too tight, my fingers raw where they had traced the eye etched into the surface of the thing I should have thrown away. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. It was proof that I hadn't imagined it, proof that something had touched me, reached inside my mind and left a mark. I needed answers. The old man had known something vital, something he had been too afraid to say outright. If I could find him, if I could make him talk, maybe, just maybe, I could break free. But as the miles stretched behind me, the weight of what I had seen, what I had felt, settled heavier in my chest. This wasn't just about knowledge anymore. It was about survival. The town was smaller than I remembered, barely more than a handful of sun-bleached buildings slouched against the weight of time. The gas station was empty, its pumps rusted and dry. The single diner sat silent, the windows dusty, the door shut tight as if it had never been open. The streets were deserted, no cars, no signs of life. A place stuck outside of time, outside of everything. And yet, I wasn't alone. I could feel them watching. Not from the windows, not from the alleys or the doorways, but from beneath. A presence buried in the earth, in the air, in the very fabric of the town itself. It was the same feeling I had on the beach, that creeping sensation that the world around me had eyes. I parked near the general store, the same place where I had first seen the old man, the same place where he had waited for me, as if he had known I would come. But now, the store was closed. The windows were boarded up, the sign on the door faded and unreadable. I hesitated before stepping out of the car, my fingers tightening around the stone in my pocket. Something had changed. The air was heavier, thick with a strange humidity that didn't match the cool morning. The sky above was cloudless, but the light felt wrong, muted, as if something vast and unseen hung just above the horizon, just out of sight. I moved cautiously through the town, my footsteps too loud on the empty pavement. Every door I tried was locked. Every window was dark. The town wasn't abandoned, it was waiting, holding its breath. And then I found him. The old man sat in the same place he had before, just outside a weathered house at the far end of the road. His chair creaked as he shifted, his clouded eyes lifting to meet mine as I approached. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had been expecting me. "You left," he said finally, his voice dry as the wind. "But you didn't get far, did you?" I swallowed hard, the weight of his gaze pressing into me like a physical force. "You knew," I said. "You knew what would happen. That it wouldn't let me go." He exhaled slowly, nodding, his fingers tightening around the arm of his chair. "No one ever really leaves," he murmured. "Not when it's seen them." I pulled the stone from my pocket, holding it up between us, my heart pounding as I turned it in my palm, letting the light catch the eye that hadn't been there before. His face darkened. "This changed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Since I left. Since I heard it." His eyes lingered on the stone for a long moment before he let out a tired sigh. "You should have thrown that away." I felt a sharp flash of anger rise in my chest. "I tried," I snapped. "It doesn't matter. It's already inside me, isn't it?" The old man didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was answer enough. I sank onto the porch steps, my head in my hands, the distant sound of waves echoing through my skull even though the ocean was miles away. "What is it?" I whispered. "What did I see?" The old man was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, heavier, like he was weighing every word. "It's older than the ocean," he said. "Older than the land. It was here before anything else, before the first wave, before the first breath. It doesn't have a name, not one we can speak. But it has always been here, sleeping beneath the tides, waiting for the right ones to hear it." I shivered, gripping my arms, trying to steady my breathing. "The ones who walked into the water," I said. "The people I saw, they weren't drowning, were they?" He shook his head. "They were going home." A sharp chill ran through me, deep and final. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it called you, too." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands clenched into fists. "Then how do I stop it?" The old man's face twisted, something like sorrow flickering in his expression. "You can't," he said. "You can run. You can fight. But once it's seen you, once you've heard it," he tapped his temple with one gnarled finger, "it never really leaves." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "There has to be a way." He hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, placing it in my hand. Another stone. This one was different, darker, smoother, the markings carved deeper, more deliberate. I felt something shift in my head the moment I touched it, like pressure releasing, like a door closing. "This won't break the tether," he said. "But it might buy you time. It might keep it from pulling you under." I stared at the stone, my breath uneven. "Might?" He nodded solemnly. "Might." The weight of it settled in my palm, heavy, final. I didn't want to ask the next question, but I had to. "And if it doesn't work?" The old man's expression darkened. He looked past me, toward the horizon, toward the place where the ocean waited, where the tide would one day pull back again. "Then when it calls next time," he said softly, "you won't be able to say no." The wind shifted, carrying the faintest whisper of salt and something else, something deeper. I closed my fingers around the stone, feeling its carved edges press into my palm. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I just got in my car, started the engine, and drove. The whisper had faded. The weight had lessened. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Not yet. Because one day, when the tide was right, when the ocean took its next great breath, it would call for me again. And this time, I wasn't sure I'd be able to resist. I didn't stop driving until the coast was nothing but a distant memory, just a stretch of black road behind me swallowed by distance and time. The stone the old man had given me sat heavy in my pocket, its carved edges pressing into my skin like a silent reminder that I was not truly free. The whisper was gone, the pull had weakened, but deep in my gut, I knew the truth. The ocean hadn't forgotten me. It had let me leave. And one day, it would take me back. I spent the next few months moving inland, deeper into the country, staying nowhere for too long. Cities felt wrong, too many people, too much noise, too much static drowning out the thing I was trying to listen for. Because I needed to know if it was truly gone, if I had escaped. But then, the dreams started again. At first, they were fragmented. Just flashes of dark water, glimpses of shapes moving beneath the surface, a feeling of weightlessness, as if I were floating, as if I had never left. But over time, they grew more vivid, more real. I would wake up gasping for air, my sheets damp, my body aching as if I had spent the night struggling against something unseen. My breath would taste like salt. My skin would feel cold and damp, even when I hadn't been near water for weeks. The worst part was the voice. It wasn't loud, not anymore. It didn't demand or plead. It suggested. It reminded. You were the first to turn away. But you will come back. One night, I woke up to find the second stone, the one the old man had given me, was gone. I searched the entire motel room, tearing through my bags, checking under the bed, in the bathroom, in places I knew I hadn't put it. But it was just gone. I knew what it meant. It had stopped working. I left town that night. I tried everything to stay away from water. I avoided lakes, rivers, even bathtubs when I could. But it didn't matter. I started seeing it in places it shouldn't be. Puddles that didn't dry up. Pools of dark liquid seeping through motel carpets, staining the floors. The faint scent of brine in places far from the shore. And then the people started watching me. It was subtle at first, just a glance held too long, a stranger standing too still on the sidewalk, eyes too dark, too empty. But over time, they got closer. The woman in the diner who didn't blink as she poured my coffee. The man in the grocery store frozen in the middle of the aisle, his head tilting at an unnatural angle as I passed. A little boy standing in a parking lot at dusk, barefoot, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. They weren't people anymore. They were waiting. I don't remember deciding to go back to the ocean. It wasn't a choice. It was something I had already done. My body had already started moving before my mind had caught up. One night, I blinked and I was driving east. The pull was stronger now, relentless, sinking into my bones like an old hunger. I had fought for so long, had convinced myself that I could escape. But I had never escaped. I had only delayed the inevitable. Because the tide had gone still. And now, it was rising. I don't remember reaching Edisto Beach, but I know that I did. The town was the same, quiet, breathless, waiting. There were no lights in the windows. No voices. No movement. Just the heavy weight of the sea pressing against the horizon, a vast, black expanse stretching endlessly under the moon. And the water had receded again. It had pulled back further than before, the seabed exposed like raw flesh, stretching out for miles, with sand glistening in the moonlight. The bones of ships long forgotten jutted from the muck like the ribs of dead things. Shapes moved in the distance, too far to see clearly, shifting, crawling, waiting. And beyond them, where the deep ocean should have been. It was there. The thing beneath the waves. The thing that had always been there, waiting. It was no longer just a shadow in the depths. It had risen higher now, massive and awake, its shape shifting, writhing, limbs or tendrils or roots unfurling like something that had been buried too long. It was not just a creature. It was the ocean itself. And the drowned were there too. They stood along the edges of the exposed seabed, barefoot, their clothes clinging to their thin, dripping bodies. I recognized some of them. The locals. The fishermen. The people I had seen walking into the water months ago. They had never truly left. And neither had I. I could hear it now, fully, clearly, its voice no longer distant, no longer a whisper. Come home. I stepped forward. I didn't want to. I did. The sand was cold beneath my bare feet. I didn't remember taking off my shoes. I didn't remember parking the car. But none of that mattered now. The others were moving too, their bodies shifting, their empty eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no hesitation. No resistance. Only acceptance. I took another step. The wind howled around me, the scent of salt thick in my lungs, the roar of the returning tide building behind us. The ocean had gone still for long enough. Now I would return. Now I would take. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, the vast and endless pull of something older than time itself. And for the first time, I understood. The fear was gone. The struggle was gone. The fight I had clung to for so long had been meaningless. Because I had never been fighting against something trying to take me. I had been fighting against something I already was. The tide crashed forward. The ocean breathed in. And I let it. Somewhere, far away, the sun will rise. The world will continue, unaware. Somewhere, a tide will pull back again. Somewhere, someone will hear it for the first time. They will fight it, as I did. They will run. But the ocean is patient. The ocean waits. And one day, when the tide is right, they will return, just as I have. Because nothing ever really leaves the sea. And nothing ever truly escapes what it has always belonged to.